Welcome back to Building the Wallace branch, and today's project is the Bunker Hill Concentrator and Mine. The concentrator was a large complex of buildings that was located just at the western edge of town, and it changed a lot over the years. As the photos and the Sanborn maps show, it had quite a few tracks, a large Stull yard, and some narrow gauge tracks leading up to the mine. It's one of the most complicated set of assets that I made for this route, and I think in the end it looks pretty good. Since the mine is still being developed today, some of the structures are still visible on Google Maps, and I started by just placing down the assets and then doing the tracks, and then finally leveling the terrain under the tracks in the buildings. A little bit of history first. The mine was discovered by Noah Kellogg in 1885, who was grub-staked to hunt for gold in the area. That's when some investors pay for a mule and food for a certain amount of time, sometimes on a monthly contract for people who are prospecting for minerals. The mine first began production in 1886. Underground, there are over 200 kilometers of tunnels and shafts. During the history of the mine, it produced over 36 million tons of ore, mainly galena or lead, and sphalerite, which is zinc. It also produced silver, which it produced over 165 million ounces. By the 1890s, the Bunker Hill and Sullivan was one of the largest and most profitable mines and concentrators, and it was the only non-unionized company in the region. It was paying 50 cents less per day than other mines. The company even employed Pinkerton detective agents to identify union members and fired any they found immediately. A superintendent once declared that he would rather shut the mines for 20 years than accept unions. On the 29th of April, 1899, Union miners hijacked a Northern Pacific train in Burke and drove it to Wardner, which was the site of a $250,000 mill owned by the Bunker Hill Company. The miners set off 3,000 pounds of dynamite and destroyed the mill, killing two men. One of them was a non-union miner, and the other was a union man accidentally shot by other union miners. The mill was rebuilt in just a few months. Within a few decades, the mine and smelter became the largest employer in Idaho, with over 7,000 employees. In all of Idaho today, incidentally, mining employment kind of bottomed out in the 1990s at under 3,000, and it's now up to around 4,000. And that's still less than 0.5% of all employment in the state. During the Depression, the company kept production high to maintain employment, even if that meant losing money. And I believe the mine closed at the same time as the smelter. The railroads and the smelter, the mine, they've all been part of the cleanup program since they were all contaminated with lead and heavy metals. In 2020, the Bunker Hill Mining Corp purchased the site, and as of December 2023, the North Idaho Business Journal quoted the CEO of that company saying that the mining would resume in 2024 and employ over 200 people, mining up to 1,800 tons of silver, lead, and zinc per year. However, it may be that the mining will actually take place at Wardner. Also, the article mentions that several previous efforts to restart the mine have all fallen through. One reason mining restarts have proven so difficult is that metals prices have always been volatile. Prices often spike, but they don't stay high for very long. In the case of lead, prices are now 4 times what they were in the 1990s, but well down from their highs around 2010. For silver, the story is even more optimistic, with prices more like 7 times their 1990s levels, though still not at their highs. For zinc, prices are a bit more than double their 1990 levels, but they've been the most volatile, sometimes spiking to higher than twice the current price, and then sometimes collapsing far below. The track layout is based largely on the Sanborn maps, although the layout of those tracks clearly changed over time. The maps show extensive tracks serving the West Mill, the North Mill, and then the main concentrator mill. This is where there really was a large transformer substation located by the main mill complex. I get the impression that these facilities used a lot of electricity. Here I'm starting to build the gigantic pile of reclaimed tailings that exists now on the site. However, this big tailings pile is a bit of a historic anachronism, since I believe at the time the concentrator was here, the tailings pile was either much smaller or perhaps located in a different area. The photos of the concentrator mill clearly show more of a swamp or a wetland, one that was indeed filled with toxic tailings and a lot of dead trees and dead vegetation, but no tailings pile at this height or on this scale or dimensions. The present tailings piles are also reclaimed and stabilized, whereas I decided to make them more black in color to reflect ongoing workings. In general, I'm trying to make this map accurate and reflect the reality of what was there, and usually I try to err on the side of making things look nicer and newer than the reality in some of the photos, but this tailings pile is a bit of an exception. There's some smaller tailings piles located to the west near the old smelter location, and here is where I'm just starting to put in a few tracks to establish the boundaries of the smelter site, which we'll be covering in the next episode. One thing the Sanborn maps don't help out much with is the elevation of the different tracks. I just tried to guesstimate based on what seemed approximately logical. Once again, I had the problem of buildings where I hadn't quite finished checking the scale of the key elements, like the height of the loading area, but these are all easy fixes, which I handled off camera. And I finally felt here like I have the track layout accurate enough to work on leveling up the terrain. It feels good, but for such a complex and multi-layer structure, it's still an iterative process. A lot of times you only discover mistakes in floating buildings a bit later. As to why the terrain here is so different from what exists today or what's in the Trainz dem, I can't quite figure that out. Texturing and details are even more iterative and somewhat repetitive, so I decided to start by adding a few of the sheds. There were indeed many sheds in the Sanborn maps. There are also a few buildings that look like small houses, but might have served as offices or administrative. Then here we also have many settling tanks, which started to come on the scene fairly early as a substitute for just pumping tailings and water directly into the river. This track is where perhaps some coal was brought in for loading into a power plant structure. The grade to reach that raised trestle unloading area is a bit steep, but still is approximately what I see in the photos. Here's where I started adding a few areas of wetland or swampy area with dead trees that you see in a lot of the period photos. I thought that having a huge area that looks like this might be a bit much, so that's why I went with this combination of high tailings pile and then small examples of polluted wetlands. For some of the trees, it's my intent to go back and make them maybe a little bit less brown and color saturated. I decided to do a bit of the texturing and clutter off camera, but still give you a bit of a taste. The Stull yard is a major occupant of real estate around these structures, and it really reflects how much lumber went into making a mine shaft back in the old days. On one side of the mill, there appears to have been a few houses and other structures, maybe for management. So that's why there's this mini neighborhood over here. Even with HD terrain, I find it actually rather difficult to do a convincing retaining wall. Then it's time for the narrow gauge track. I just used something I found off the DLS, and I didn't try to make the curves or grades particularly realistic, since this is just a scenery asset, really. The actual Bunker Hill mine is based on this photo from the Barnard Stockbridge collection, but it's not clear to me exactly where the mine was located. Probably closer to Wardner, or actually maybe in Wardner. Anyway, I just connected it to the closest narrow gauge tracks, and again, this is more of a scenery or background item, not intended for any actual operations. It was a surprisingly difficult one to place down, given that it has many different terrain levels, and then it's also wedged into the end of this narrow valley. So I'm placing it next to the concentrator. The grades on the narrow gauge tracks and road, they're pretty steep, arguably unrealistic. Finally, I'm adding a few more minor details like these gorgeous ore cars. And the last thing before we cut away is just started to extend the track layout a little bit more towards the smelter, and we'll be getting to that in the next episode, of course, so stay tuned. If you like what you see in this episode, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the Wallace Branch.